Hello again, friends, and welcome to the May episode of Access City Hall on the Madison City Channel. I'm your host, Stu Levitan. Thanks for being with us. The first function of government is the protection of its people and their property. In Madison, that awesome task is the responsibility of the Madison Police Department, which this year will spend close to $70 million in its pursuit. Our guest this hour is the man responsible for making sure that money is spent wisely and well, and the man held responsible when it isn't, Police Chief Mike Koval. Chief Koval joined the department in 1983, spending most of his career in recruitment and training. The Police and Fire Commission picked Koval to succeed former Chief Noble Ray in April 2014. Chief Koval, thanks very much for being with us.
Good to be back.
How have these last 3 years changed you?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm a little more, I think I've aged in dog years. It's been 3 years and I feel like it's 30, so to speak. There's been an awful lot of events, episodes, incidents that have obviously piqued a lot of attention, not only locally but nationally. But in each and every instance, I remind others, as well as my own members of my own department at times, that we are ultimately going to be defined by the narrative we write day to day, one call at a time, and not necessarily the episodic events that can necessarily hallmark the news cycle.
But on a personal level, have the last 3 years made you more short-tempered? Or would the Mike Koval of March 2014 have called Tony Robinson's grandmother a raging lunatic? Would you have reacted so adversely to the council's study to review the department?
Well, and again, with both the instances you just mentioned, there's a context, there's a beginning as well as an end, and you're citing sort of the middle. And so there's an awful lot of things that pervasively affected those particular instances, that council meeting, or the instances where I was inappropriate in calling anyone a lunatic. So to that extent, I would say, yes, I'm human. I have those same foibles, the feet of clay that anyone else would, and I wish I had been more considered in my response in instances like that. But I would also suggest that if this community thought they were getting a polished, well-coiffed, charismatic person who would say the right things to the right people at the right time, I'm not that guy. I tend to tell you exactly what I think, and I have principles, and those principles are very important to me in leading this department. And I think that I am not defensive of, but I'm in defense for 470 selfless servant guardians that I think at times have been thrown under the bus. And one of my responsibilities is to basically defend and protect them as well from those persons who would not support us, not support their efforts, or only choose to look at those instances that are negative. And I think there's an awful lot of positive synergy happening from the women and men of the Madison Police Department. And my role as the police chief is to make sure that that message gets out as well.
Not to get in the mindset of the Police and Fire Commission, but I'm willing to bet they knew you weren't well coiffed at the time they
my
hired you.
haircut has been fairly consistent.
Yeah, I think that didn't come as a surprise. I mentioned the $400,000 study. What is the status of that study?
Well, they come, the ORI group, for whom the city contracted with an RFP, they arrive in Madison every 6 to 8 weeks and give us a laundry list of people they want to talk to, constituents, a lot of data downloads, things that they want, questions and interrogatories sort of answered. And then they fly back to their base camp, and we're expecting that by the end of the year in December, they should have a published finding.
And what form will that report or findings take? Do we know?
Well, it'll have to conform to all the needs of the RFP, which was quite comprehensive. So I suspect they'll be looking at issues relative to our hiring, our training, our policies, our procedures. I think they'll go to the very culture of who we are and try to provide constructive elements where we could be better.
Talk about some things that are in the news right now. You recently spent $18,000 for two quadcopter drones.
Oh, no.
No.
Drones are the military term.
Okay, then these are what?
Unmanned aircraft systems.
Uns-
UAS is the civilian complementary term.
You mean unstaffed? Unmanned would be a
Yes.
sexist term. Unstaffed.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, thank you.
Let's call them drones because that's what everybody thinks they are. You at the and
That wasn't recently, by the way. Those had been purchased some time ago.
it only the council and some it became widely known only relatively recently.
Well, we spoke to the mayor and the council leadership over a month ago. It's only some apparently are getting that word Johnny-come-lately.
As in general rule, a month constitutes recent. Yeah, in roughly the same time period, you also asked for a mid-year transfer of $20,000 for the anti-opiate drug Naloxone.
Naloxone. And that's why I have to give you the chronology.
Okay.
We had purchased the drones before we had understood or came to understand that the persons who had been responsible for producing this product had put it at astronomical price prohibitive points for the public. So we had already acquired the drones, and then and only then did we come to find out about our manufacturer that we had used for the last 2 years was going to basically engage in what is tantamount to price gouging the public. And so that came after the purchase.
So that's the So when Alder Kemble says that this is backwards, you should have spent the money that you had on the drug and then come to the council for the transfer for the drone.
That would have been possible if we weren't doing history revisionism. Yeah. That's not how the timeline worked.
You gestured like this when you're talking about that. Do you have one of those pens with you? Is that?
It's not a pen. It's a nasal inhaler ready to come out of the hermetically sealed box.
And do all officers carry that now?
Yes.
And how often have they had to be used?
Unfortunately, way too much. The opiate issue is more of an issue now of obviously public health as a matter of just public safety. So as it relates to this whole thing is that we use these probably a couple times a week.
Are people arrested at the same time? Are they for heroin? Are they for prescription drugs?
Well, it can be
opiates?
An opiate prohibitor of any kind, but typically in our market we're seeing heroin. What you'll find is that, yes, there is at this point, until our MARI grant kicks in this summer. Right now, if they're stable, we would give them a citation for an order-in date. And in that period of time then, some point, the referring prosecutor authority would see whether this would be an appropriate diversionary court for drug court or whether it's be some other mechanism. But yes, they are formally, I guess, because a citation is left, you would be arrested in that sense, but there's no one being taken to jail after just coming out of an overdose.
What accounts for the opiate problem we're having?
Well, price point is phenomenal. It's about $150 a gram. It's readily accessible. It's never been more potent. We get most of our CRs mostly come up through Chicago.
CRs?
Heroin.
Okay.
And
what does that stand? What does CR stand for? You said CRs.
Oh, we see most of our heroin
CR.
coming up through Chicago as a matter of distribution network. And lately, a lot of the heroin has also been laced with fentanyl, which makes it almost 10 times more difficult to deal with. So we're seeing obviously an increase in not just overdoses, but we're also seeing an increase over the last 3 years of people who succumb and die from the overdose. We only have a fraction of the responses where Madison Fire Department does even more.
Is the community reacting differently to this drug problem than it did to crack and cocaine and other drug issues? Are people starting to see this as a health issue and a criminal justice issue instead of just a criminal justice issue?
I do think there's been a blurring of the lines to understand that this is more of addiction issues, which makes it more in keeping with obviously a health model. Although obviously we can't very well discount the fact that since I was here during the epic cocaine use as well, there is no doubt but the fact that there's also, as there is in so many of our issues, there's a certain race issue to this. Frankly, you have a lot more white people that are using heroin and overdosing, and so I don't mean to be naive or cynical, but I think that to some extent that is also part of the traction, that there has been a paradigm shift in looking at it as a health model.
That has not gone unnoticed, that when crack and cocaine were a black issue, it was dealt with in a severe law enforcement, and now that it's hillbilly heroin and a lot of white people, it's got a different paradigm.
I think that we're all complicit in this. The media, the cops, the courts, everybody's got a part of that.
We'll get back to the drug issue in a bit, but to finish up on drones, the policy for drone use, whose authority is it to develop the policy on drones and retention of drone videos?
Well, there's going to be a hierarchy of needs, so to speak. I suspect that the city will have and does have some sort of APMs that apply to all agencies, irrespective of what your tools or tasks are. I know building and inspection uses drones to see those difficult navigable areas, for example, in airspace. We are using them in the applications that we'll develop policy for that are respectful of privacy, of course, but we've used drones from other agencies, have invoked mutual aid for people who have, for example, eloped from dementia care centers, for children, for fugitives who've recently committed crimes. And they've been very helpful in terms of doing aerial surveillance of what we consider a crime scene for court purposes and showing a wide swatch of area that was used in a crime.
I can imagine there have been some disappearances that in previous years that a drone would have been very useful.
Well, it's amazing how quickly you can muster them, so to speak. When we have had some luck using other agencies, we've used Middleton Fire, we've used the Wisconsin State Patrols. There are some other neighboring agencies, but anytime you go through that chain of command, the clock is ticking, and it's probably a good hour to an hour and a half before you can have someone site ready. By having our own, we are able to do a more ready response to those needs as they're occurring in real time.
And what about the retention of the video?
Well, any video that we shoot, and first of all, not everything would necessarily have a video component, but any video, as you know, subject to anything from a camera, would have to go through an open record sort of request. So those retention schedules will vary depending on the nature of the underlying issue.
And so will the drone video have the exact same policy as dashboard video?
It depends. Again, if there's no criminal charge, no, it probably has no evidentiary value. So that retention level can probably be nominal at best.
Are there Fourth Amendment issues and constitutional issues when police can do certain things when something is in plain sight versus when it isn't, when the drone so exponentially expands what plain sight is, do we have unresolved Fourth Amendment issues as to where you can look?
Well, I think we have to be circumspect in understanding that we are still going to be governed. We don't get special sort of exemptions in the sense of what is or isn't considered privacy and what's reasonable. You're not going to use a drone, for example, to navigate itself up to a second bedroom window to look into someone's bedroom. Even though you're in navigable airspace, that's not the kind of use for which we would intend it. And we have worked with the city attorney's office in looking at what those parameters ought to be. And we've also had calls placed to the ACLU to try to make sure that we're on the same page in understanding what we won't use it for.
But if you're flying a drone on a rescue, search and rescue, sure, and within the camera you see inside an apartment building's courtyard, outside but within the four walls of the courtyard, someone's growing some pot or they're doing something illegal. Do you have now? Can you go in there now? Have you seen it under plain sight?
I think it would be depending on whether you're still working within the FAA navigable airspace, even for drones.
Okay. If I see somebody's private drone within my airspace, outside my window, can I take it out?
In terms of self-help mechanism.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to get into, especially in the city of Madison, you can't discharge a firearm in the city.
No, but can I get my wasp spray and
Well,
spray
I know
it?
that there's a certain castle doctrine. I didn't know it would ever apply to drones.
I don't see why not. I'll take that as legal. The chief said I could do it.
Don't, please. I got enough problems.
I posted on my Facebook page that I was having this interview and asked for questions. And Amelia Royko-Maurer, on this point, said that you had said that you would not introduce drones without public commentary, without a discussion among the public regarding this.
Well, there can still be public commentary, but at the end of the day, this remains the prerogative of an operational sense of what the police do. In terms of the public commentary, that public commentary didn't have to be unique or specific to Madison. I think we as a society have seen them. I mean, they were flying off the shelves at Christmas time. And so the FAA is dealing with it. The state is dealing with it in terms of its regulatory schemes. It's been administratively going to be dealt with by the city of Madison and its attorneys. So in terms of public commentary, the public commentary is there.
And what is the status of body cams?
Well, again, that was a component that was left to the RFP of the ad hoc committee that commissioned the $400,000 study. I would assume that when we initially used a micro study using the YWCA to sort of understand what it is that underrepresented demographics of Madison wanted, that $35,000 study a couple falls ago came to the conclusion that the public was not ready, or that group of constituents didn't feel that looking at what the money could be going for, arguably, the cameras was the best receptacle. Some talked about some social programs and some innovations in that capacity would be more beneficial at promoting trust and getting urgent services into people's hands. So that committee, I think, was a 4-2 vote against body cameras. And there was set aside money put for a pilot program in the event that there was a sort of change of heart or change of mind. Then I think that when the $400,000 study was commissioned, one of the elements was, well, we'll bring it up again in the context of that comprehensive study. So I believe that that might still be arguably a part of what will be discussed in December when they have their published findings. At the end of the day, my position in this has been I don't want to unilaterally say that the police department is going to do it until the policymakers who understand that we're looking at an initial investment of literally for the whole department over $900,000 in server space and additional operating expenses for people who are going to have to digest, catalog, and evidentiary tag and open records requests. So once we sort of release the toothpaste from the squeeze, we're forever going to be trying to pack it back in. So I just want to make sure that the police department isn't being blamed for taking such a huge commodity of fiscal resources for body cameras, unless or until everybody believes that's the appropriate way to go.
Do you want them? Do you not want them?
The cops want them.
The cops. Why do the cops want them?
They say we've got nothing to hide. We're transparent. We're professional. And frankly, if you'll look at the national statistics, body-worn cameras more likely exonerate officers of claims as opposed to indict them. So the cops have no problem in terms of doing it, wearing the cameras. Some have even come to me one-to-one to say, I'll go down to Best Buy and I'll buy a GoPro today. Can I do that? And I said, no, because what am I going to do with the serving space? Where are we going to put that? No, we have to wait for the public to give us permission to use it.
I think if an officer showed up with a GoPro on her head, that would be weird.
Well, you know, we do use cameras in some contexts already. Well, you already mentioned they're on the dash. So every time the car's visibar lights are on, you're on candid camera, you're being taped and recorded. Anytime we do a Miranda interview with a juvenile, those are recorded. Anytime we do a Miranda interview with an adult who's charged with a felony, those are taped. Anytime our SWAT team for the last 3 years goes on an operation, the SWAT entry is all on camera.
Speaking of cameras, we've got one that we've got to take a break from.
Okay.
This is the May episode of Access City Hall. We're going to take a short pause for some important messages and be back with more with Police Chief Mike Koval. Please stay with us.
amigos, soy Thalía. Como mamá de 2 niños pequeños, sé que March of Dimes ayuda a todos los bebés a tener el comienzo más sano y fuerte en la vida. Por eso me enorgullece apoyar la marcha por los bebés. Espero que puedas caminar conmigo. El dinero recaudado respalda importantes investigaciones y programas para prevenir los graves problemas que amenazan a nuestros bebés. Únete conmigo. Inscríbete en la Marcha por los Bebés en marchforbabies.org.
Welcome back to the May episode of Access City Hall on the Madison City Channel. I'm still Stu, you're still you. We're still talking to Police Chief Mike Koval. Chief, what do you know now that you wish you'd known when you started as chief 3 years ago?
How much is dictated by the politics of Madison? A lot of politics in terms of who decides who should run the police department.
It doesn't sound like you mean that in a good way.
I think sometimes I've had to literally try to remind people that at the end of the day, I think that those who are wise enough to craft provisions for insulating police chiefs in Wisconsin from the political foibles and the vagaries of nepotism and all the other temptations that could lend itself to, is that now I still think that there's a faction of people that believe that they ought to dictate how police operations will run from a day-to-day basis, how all the policies should be specifically generated. And I agree that there has to be a participatory element of community infused, because we are the community are the police, but not to the extent of violent overthrow that some would like to see.
Are you talking about people on the council, people in the community, or people on the Police and Fire Commission?
I would say in the community, there are those who, for whatever reason, believe that the Madison Police Department does not reflect the needs and the values of this community. And I feel at times they have been given a disproportionate voice in the marketplace of ideas, so much so that I think a lot of reasonableness has been hijacked, coerced, and co-opted. And so that's the part that makes me continue to fight on.
How are you going to address that?
I'm a reasonable man, and I look at policies and recommendations and try to see what we can do and what can be managed and what's appropriate. But to the extent that they're going to dictate the day-to-day or the hour-to-hour operations, that's not their purview.
How effective is the Police and Fire Commission in providing what is supposed to be the structural community involvement or oversight?
Well, again, that would suggest in part that your question is that the only mechanism for control of the police? And I would say it's not. It is a regulatory function in terms of hiring, firing, and punishing police officers and police chiefs. And to that extent, that's very, very important that they have that independency and that autonomy, that someone can take a complaint to the Madison Professional Standards Unit, not like the outcome of whatever that investigation resolution was, and they can go independently to the Police and Fire Commission to get a completely independent view of what's going on. But remember, we have the Fourth Estate that controls the police. We have the council, which basically controls the funding of police. And as we've seen in Madison recently, you also have the specter of lawsuits, civil lawsuits that control the police, not to mention the fact that we are constantly regulated by federal and state authorities that through the Department of Justice make sure that civil rights aren't being violated. So I'm always somewhat bemused by those who say that there isn't any community empowerment over the police when I see there being many levels of that.
On the matter of lawsuits, the city's insurer recently settled the lawsuit arising out of the death of Tony Robinson for $3.35 million, which my understanding is the largest settlement in the state of Wisconsin history for a police-involved death. You have expressed unhappiness that it was settled. Tony Robinson's mother has expressed unhappiness that it was settled. Would the public interest have been better served by a trial with evidence and testimony under oath? Would that have provided some more closure, or would that have been just even more divisive and further inflamed antagonisms and hurtful feelings?
Well, I think that could have gone either way. I think you're right. I think that the longer this is a protracted inquiry, the possibility is that it's going to be continually more difficult to move forward, to heal, to find some common ground of reconciliation. But I think you have to remember, when you say a lawsuit is being brought, the police department don't dictate that. There's a plaintiff who makes an intentional decision to say, we have been wronged, and the mechanism at law for us to have that redressed is through litigating the matter. So when you say that there's a settlement, could both parties have benefited by a trial? We'll never know. That calls for speculation, because we'll never have had that opportunity.
Would you like to see a change in the system so that the police department or the chief would have to sign off on a settlement, or are you comfortable leaving it in the hands of the insurance company?
I'm comfortable with leaving it in the hands of policymakers who are ultimately answerable to an elected constituency, and I'm answerable to the mayor and to the council. I think that where the concern is that I would at least like to have had some say before the decision has been made.
But ultimately, who do you think should have the power to settle or not settle?
The plaintiff.
Well, it takes two to settle.
Mm-hmm.
So from the city's perspective, is there somebody, do you think the system should be changed so that the mayor, not the insurance company, can say, no, we're not doing that. It's not, the reputation is more important than the money, and I'd rather risk losing $5 million than agree to $3 million because I want this to go to trial?
Well, I think arguably the scenario that you describe is theoretically in place right now. If the mayor or someone else in authority had said, damn the torpedoes, we're going to go to trial whether you want to settle or not, I think that's the prerogative then in a business model such as it is, where the insurer says, that's fine, we're willing to pay up to X number of dollars. Are you willing to absorb any excess? And I think that's where you get into this sort of blink.
The free market of ideas and reputation has a limit to how free it is.
It is.
How long will it take Madison and its various communities, in which I include the police, to get past the Tony Robinson tragedy?
Oh, that's really a tough one for me, because as much as I would like to believe that each day on every call and in every engagement, our officers are making the effort to try to show what we're capable of as guardians, but I think that that's naive. There will always be an element of Madison, as we've seen with the Heenan case. The same people that were very antagonistic towards Chief Ray and the Madison Police Department from the Heenan shooting, those folks have just rolled it over into this one, and it's a lot of the same people. And frankly, we can only do what we can do. We can only suggest to those who are willing to be reasonable is that the Madison Police Department handles 15,000 to 18,000 calls a month. And we lay a hand on someone with any measure of force less than 0.012 of 1%. So the suggestion that all of these encounters between the police and our citizens are encapsulated by the presence, implied or expressed use of force is just not the case.
So you're comfortable with the current standard for use of force responses?
The current standard, the standard articulated by the state of Wisconsin, for which all agencies are certified, is that basically you only use lethal or deadly force when there is an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm to you or to another person. That has basically captured the precedent of Graham versus Connor, which has been the judicial precedent throughout this country since 1989. Yes, I believe that this job is difficult enough as it's currently constituted, without trying to create a standard in which there's the Monday morning second-guessing quarterbacking, undermining what wasn't or what was occurring at the time that that dynamic unfolded. So Unless or until the state changes its standard, we're going to be keeping the same state standard.
And do other states use that same standard?
I believe virtually all, although there's nothing to suggest that you as an individual agency can't create a different standard. But as my own city attorney would advise you, why in the world would you put your officers at greater liability and risk than anybody else?
How much was the Tony Robinson situation exacerbated by the racial component?
Well, there's no doubt that any time, and I never would have thought that I'd find myself in this position as chief. I so thought that we were light years ahead of the incidents like you'd seen in Ferguson. But at the end of the day, when you distill everything and synthesize it down to the basic common denominators, when a relatively young, unarmed black man is killed at the hands of a white police officer, whether I like it or not, I am in the same paragraph as a Ferguson. So issues of so much of what we see in our culture today in our Madison, whether it be the schools, whether it be the economic opportunities, whether it be housing, you cannot escape the inescapable, and that is race is implicit to a lot of these discussions.
Do you feel a need, as a former recruitment and training officer, do you feel a need for additional racial sensitivity training to address either the urgency of a crime scene or the aftermath of a crime scene when we've got a variety of races involved?
Oh, I think anytime, and again, we've been very proud of the fact that we have been probably one of the country's leaders in that 9 going on 10 years now working with then Professor Patricia Devine at the university. We have been the test guinea pigs, if you will, for a lot of unconscious or implicit bias studies, and similarly we have incorporated it into our vernacular, to how we train our recruits, to our getting our booster shots of training on and implicit biases and things like that. And cultural competencies are very important to a community as diverse as Madison. So we have days in the training seminars where we do full days, 8 hours with Hmong leaders, another 8 hours with African American, another 8 hours with Latinos. I think the more you can grow out of an experience and learn from those that are different than you, the better the communication, the dialogue, and those suppositions start to fall. And I think that makes for better policing and better communities.
Well, let's talk about racial disparities for another minute. Blacks and whites smoke pot at about the same rate. Yet blacks make up more than half the people arrested or cited for marijuana charges, even though they represent, and this is in Madison, even though they represent only 7% of the population. That means they're arrested 12 times the rate of whites, and it's almost as bad for non-drug offenses as well. Whites are arrested at a rate of 2.6 per 100 residents, blacks 27.6 per 100 residents. What accounts for those numbers?
Well, I think there's a lot of social economic status indicators for that as well. You have to remember that as much as I'd like to believe that we're behind every bush ready to creep on crime and interrupt it at its inception, over 98% of our calls for service are people calling, third parties, calling the 911 center. This is what I see happening, come quick. Whether they're victims, witnesses, complainants, sometimes even a suspect thinks if I call first in a domestic, I'm not going to get arrested. So we have all these people calling us, so we really don't have any say-so in terms of dictating in a reactive sort of way who the players are when we get there. We are supposed to be very good at articulating behaviors which are unlawful, and do they rise to the level of ticketing or arrest? And that's what we're trying to tell people, is that when you're being called in, we don't pick and choose. It'd be one thing if you said, you know, the Madison Police Department is racially profiling and doing all of this stuff. Well, that's proactive. I'd like to see that. But in this instance, as so often, we are reacting to calls or reacting to behaviors.
Okay, so hypothetical.
Yep.
63-year-old white man smoking a joint on his front stoop in Tacoma.
Is that you?
This is a hypothetical, Chief.
Okay.
20-year-old black man smoking a joint on his front stoop on Allied Drive. Same cop sees both of them. Mm-hmm. Do they have the same likelihood of getting arrested or cited?
Well, I'd like to say that either one, it depends, because we don't know what the circumstances are. But I would say, frankly, casual possession of marijuana is not high on our Richter scale. Right now, the fine for carrying an open can of Coors Light down State Street is twice what it is smoking a doobie. So it's not really one of those things that we're putting a lot of enforcement priorities into, to be perfectly honest.
Actually, the price for drinking Coors is social ostracism. And this, I actually am asking this for a friend. When was the last time you arrested somebody just for simple possession of pot?
For me?
Or the department, I mean.
Oh, you know, it usually has to be in conjunction with several other factors, like you were disorderly or resisting arrest, and oh, by the way, you're smoking pot. But it's one of those things that, you know, in Madison, it's been basically decriminalized for almost 4 decades, so this gets like absolutely no time or attention, really.
How much would your life be easier? How much would police officers' life be easier if marijuana were legalized and you didn't even have to, and you didn't have to worry about it at all?
Well, and I've sort of got myself in trouble on one other end of the political spectrum, because I think that casual possession of drugs should be decriminalized. It's one thing if you're exploiting, manufacturing, distributing, and profiteering off illegal drugs. But for me, I see that the brick and mortar solution of arrest and throwing people into jail does not get to the root causes of addiction, does not deal with the problems of addiction, and frankly, are too expensive.
We spoke earlier about heroin. Is that related to gangs?
In some of its distribution elements, perhaps, but not necessarily indicative of gang use.
What is the gang situation in Madison?
Well, if you listen to our gang officers, they'll tell you that it's on the rise, only because it's a symptom of brokenness in systems. So if you're going to school and you're not being affirmed and you're not enjoying any success, and you drop out, there's not a whole lot of options for you developmentally in terms of where you can get a job, where you can find housing. So like-minded individuals in the same situations tend to find or congregate one another. Your peers become a part of, if not replacement for, your family. So when we have, frankly, only about slightly over 50% of our African-American young men graduating from MMSD, we have an awful lot of people that are not enjoying success. And when you're not enjoying success, desperate individuals are inclined to engage in more desperate activities and involvements. And I think that's part and parcel. If we had a better litmus test for the socio-economic and educational ways that we can affirm people, there's less likelihood for people then to seek that affirming behavior from a gang.
Now, are these gangs, as we used to know them, you know,
Oh,
Crips,
it's not
Bloods,
like-
Blackstone Rangers?
Well,
or-
yeah,
or-
some of that, yeah.
Okay.
Because that's sort of, I thought you were going back to Jets and Sharks from West Side Story. No.
Not that much of a
Oh,
historian,
okay, I just
so
want to make sure.
thanks, yeah.
No, we still have those as the core or parent groups, but we have gangs that are Madison homegrown that have created their own little names.
What are some of the names?
Oh, it's just, again, you're talking about some of the ones like the Fellas Gang and Money Gang and stuff like that. That's not a national gang, but they have derivatives from parent gangs, if you will, in some of the bigger cities.
Any Madtown Marauders?
There was a Madtown Boys, but not Marauders.
Okay, that would just be too cute. We're going to take a short pause for the cause. We've got some important announcements for you. Then we're going to come back with more with Madison Police Chief Mike Koval. It is the May episode of Access City Hall on the Madison City Channel. Please stay with us.
Without this donor, we wouldn't have our child. Our donor is somewhere out there, and we have the most profound amount of love and gratitude for this total stranger. He will be turning 5 because somebody out there donated to him. I just hope people know that when they swab their cheeks and sign up for the registry, how they are going to change a family's life forever.
¿Qué tal, amigos? Soy Talía. Como mamá de 2 niños pequeños, sé que March of Dimes ayuda a todos los bebés a tener el comienzo más sano y fuerte en la vida. Por eso me enorgullece apoyar la marcha por los bebés. Espero que puedas caminar conmigo. El dinero recaudado respalda importantes investigaciones y programas para prevenir los graves problemas que amenazan a nuestros bebés. Únete conmigo. Inscríbete en la Marcha por los Bebés en marchforbabies.org.
Welcome back to the final segment of the May episode of Access City Hall on the Madison City Channel. We're talking with Madison Police Chief Mike Koval. As I mentioned earlier, I posted on my Facebook page that we were having this interview, and I asked for questions. And Alder Sacha Rhodes Conway had a really great question. What would be the best investment the city could make in public safety outside the police department?
Probably my premonition is that as go the fortunes of Madison schools, so go the fortunes of our community. So I've always looked at sort of two subsets. How are we doing in the schools as one litmus test, and how are we doing in our most challenging or challenged neighborhoods? And that, to me, are the predictive benchmarks of what's going to happen. And my concern is that MMSD, the school district, 27,000 enrolled kids, when you have literally 50% of them qualifying for federal subsidies for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that speaks volumes about the Madison that is so vastly different than when I grew up or when you grew up in Madison. It speaks to the poverty, it speaks to the needs, it speaks to the lack of us being able to connect kids with resources and affirming them in learning. So I would say that if we could continue to look at economic growth and educational support systems for our kids, if we can, I have a good friend, Floyd Rose from 100 Black Men, and he says, Chief, if there's one thing that I could want of all the vast array of options, it would be have every kid read to grade level specificity. Because he has come to make me, and I've been a believer in that, if kids are reading to grade level specificity, meaning they're being affirmed and they're enjoying success in their school, they're going to hang around, stay around, matriculate, and at least if you've got the high school degree option under you, you might be able to go into skilled trades, go on to college, military options. There are at least some options, but if we continue to see kids dropping by the wayside and not matriculating from even our high schools, that's concerning because then it perpetuates the other economic concerns.
See, I think the big problem is ninth grade algebra. The ninth grade algebra is like where people fail ninth grade algebra, and then it's like a sliding slope.
Thank you, Miss Becker. She's the only reason I'm here today.
Yeah. In terms of the schools and the educational resource officers, who sets do the officers and the department retain the full authority to decide who they bring into the criminal justice system and who they don't, or does the school system have any authority other than the binary, we're hiring you or we're not? How does that work?
We're not just mere sort of subcontractors. No, we don't relinquish any of our statutory powers of arrest or anything like that. But we want to be a complementary piece, not an oil and vinegar sort of adversary there. In that sense, there's a couple committees looking at how we can better grow that relationship of understanding. We are philosophically 100% behind the school district's attempts at what they call the BEP, the Behavioral Education Program, whereby ticketing or arresting, suspension or expulsion are the least desirable mechanism for keeping kids in school. And we're supporting that, and we will continue to work with our partners at MMSD to do that. But when it sort of transgresses the line of public safety, then we still exercise that prerogative.
Do officers who are assigned as EROs have special particularized training to be in that environment and to especially to deal with children who may be misbehaving?
I think so, yes. A lot of them, first of all, have the passion for working with that age group. It's an audition process, if you will. They just picked some new ones last week, and it's a consortium of faculty, students, staff, MMSD, and MPD personnel. And the point is, you're coming in with your freshman class, and you're exiting when they become seniors. So over the course of that 4 years, you've come to get to sort of know those kids in a very relational way, in a way that can connect and not say, we're playing gotcha here, but we want to try to prove and enhance your ability to succeed here. And in that sense, right now we've got a wonderful program taking place at Memorial, for example. They're reading a fiction, All-American Boy. It's pretty contentious, doesn't make the cops look good at all. But they had asked, the district had asked, do you mind if we make this our all-school book? Because we're concerned we don't want to ruffle any feathers at MPD. And I said, no, if this is what the kids want to read, if this is what will create and promote a dialogue, my only ask out of this is, can my cops participate in the forums? And so I've got about 20, 25 cops that are participating, and I think it's been great. It's been very symbiotic.
And it's a 4-year assignment then?
Yeah, it's a 4-year assignment.
And then you cycle out in?
You cycle out when they're seniors.
And can you then go back and start anew, or are you then back out on the...
You might be able to get a 1-year extension if there was some extraordinary mechanism, but we want to have other officers have that opportunity.
What about other officers? What ongoing training do officers have, either for civil rights and legal rights, or response? What is the ongoing training aspect?
Well, every year, in order to stay certified under the state, we have to come up with 24 hours of ongoing education, much like an attorney or a teacher would have to do. And in that sense, it depends on what's sort of trending and what's topical. Some things, once a year you have to do a mandatory qualification firearm shoot, but that takes an hour. So you have a lot of time to use subject content areas that can be very helpful in terms of what's happening out in the community that's beneficial. So for us, this last fall, we did another 8 hours of retuning and looking and revisiting at all of our de-escalation techniques under crisis intervention strategies. So it can be very topical to what you think is happening or what this community specifically needs.
For all of our sake, I hope your officers pay more attention to your training than attorneys do to their CLE training.
They do.
That's all.
And we take roll at the beginning, in the middle, and the end.
All I got to say about that. On the matter of training, the brainstorming whiteboard for dealing with problems at the top of State Street that Dylan Brogan wrote about in Isthmus a while ago. Some of the ideas were legitimate. Then you get into things like unlimited heroin laced with fentanyl, frequent carpet bombing, tiger pits, quicksand, an environmentally appropriate organic lava flow. These are largely officers whom you recruited and trained who said and wrote these things. Mm-hmm. How did that happen?
Well, I think, as you said, what started out was a great opportunity from problem solving, doing some nominal group things, then became sort of a very inappropriate form of humor. And knowing all those officers, all of them came forward. They all owned it. They understood that it was inappropriate. We dealt with it, and we've moved on. You'll see that a lot of those officers are phenomenal humanitarians and have done a lot of work for the community and with the community up in that very troubled area.
Was there discipline involved?
Well, we did an investigation. It depends on what your prior track record is, but in this instance, they were all documented with having been inappropriate for a workplace.
What is the solution to the top of State Street?
Well, I don't know. I think there's an awful lot that has to be looked at in terms of, I know the mayor is looking at making it an aesthetic food park with a lot more trailers and a lot more open spaces where families and people can congregate, and that these spaces aren't going to be monopolized. But I do think we have to sort of create some standards of expectations. There are some things that cannot be tolerated because you're now impinging upon the rights and safety of others and the ability of others to enjoy that same common ground. I think therein lies the constant balancing of rights.
I think there's universal acceptance, or at least understanding the fact that there's less social peer pressure on people to behave in public.
I think that's true.
I find it, for me, it's because I'm afraid if I say something to somebody, they're going to shoot me.
Well, and frankly, one of the people that has been standing up there is very proudly an open carry advocate. And if you were trying to call that person out and say, hey, that behavior is inappropriate, and in the meantime I can see the gun sitting there on your hip, that would too give me, I think the reason that people like yourself or parents that used to feel comfortable parenting other kids, we sort of gone into our silos owing to self-preservation to some extent and not wanting to sort of offend others.
Can we ever fix that?
Again, I think that owing to some sort of environmental strategy in terms of what you're going to situate up there, how you're going to light it, what you're going to attract, what you're not going to tolerate, and are the police there to make those natural consequences occur swiftly? I think we can.
You mentioned the 460 officers earlier. What percent do you think or fear have some element of emotional or substance abuse issues? And do you have any early identification method to identify those situations and address?
Well, again, we go to briefings with one another, and we are guardians not only of the community, but over one another's behaviors. So if those issues are occurring in our workplace, more often than not, they are brought forward by a coworker, not so much a citizen, but by a coworker, which to me speaks volumes for the fact that we don't have this sort of blue curtain of silence where people are afraid or reticent to call out behavior that's inappropriate like that. In terms of early warning systems, we had what I considered a very flawed computer software program known as AIM. And when I took office, I said, we've got to find something infinitely better than this because it's not very instructive, it's not very helpful, it's not very timely, and it's complicated to use. We did get one, it's called IA Pro, it's got the capabilities, and hopefully by the end of the year, we will be able to do more of that early intervention. But I will tell you that every 2 weeks, I go through with internal affairs all of the use of force reports, any high-speed pursuits, any crashes, what the sick time balances are. So we are doing what we're doing informally now every 2 weeks that we will be ultimately ready to do with keystrokes once the IA Pro software is fully operational for that.
Is there an industry average on what percent of officers do have the potential for problems?
You know, I think that's changed radically since when I first came in, because you used to see things at about the 7-year high water mark, where a lot of that cynicism and poor behavior or bad habits were, and depending on the culture of the shop you're in, could also sort of enable that. But in Madison, you know, I started with a group of nothing but Vietnam veteran high school, maybe a year or two of MATC grads, to now you look at our workspace, it's incredibly diverse, nobody's smoking. It's wonderful.
You mentioned the use of force. You got a COPS grant for use of force coordinator. Been, I think, on the job for about 6-7 months now.
Yeah.
What is that? How is that working? What are the findings?
I really like it because it provides yet another tier of quality control and assurance. All use of force has to be reported individually and then reported to the supervisor. And then those reports have to be typed. And then this is yet another tier where we're looking to see, is everything being done according to our training? Do we need to do remediation? Is this officer appearing too frequently in our bi-weekly discussions? All of those things I think have had a lot of help, not to mention the fact that he routinely gets asked to go out in the field with me and speak to groups and sort of debunk a lot of the urban myths that people have about force. So it's been an educational platform, there's a research platform. He's able to research best practices from across the country. I send him to conferences for PERF and the IACP. So yes, I think it's going to establish yet another level of transparency and accountable that our community will appreciate.
Are there surprises that you're finding in the early statistics? Are there statistics?
Really. Yeah. As a matter of fact, we publish our use of force reports every quarter. We give all our statistics. That's on our website so people can index them and see.
We got a couple minutes left. In terms of personal and public safety, what should we be more worried about than we are?
What should we be more worried about? Well, I think we're finally seeing the traction that with people that are addicted to substances, whether it be heroin or alcohol, or whether people have afflictions in dealing with a mental illness and they have an episodic break, we are seeing we have a lot of the behaviors that police are dealing with are invariably dealing with people who are impaired, have issues, are struggling, have been undiagnosed, aren't taking their prescriptions, should be taking a prescription. There are so many facets of the human condition that are out there. And as Madison has grown steadily, exponentially over the years, we are seeing the telltale signs of what it's like to be a big city with big city urban issues. And I think there's a part of us who are minimizing and rationalizing that the worst thing we got going is a kegger on Saturday night on Langdon Street at a fraternity party. Man, I would die for those days. You know, we have a very, very difficult challenge for our law enforcement community, because with more and more social service agencies being constricted and defunded and undersourced, you're asking that police officer, the 24/7 social service agency provider, to be doing more perhaps than we ought to, should do, or can capably handle.
Are officers getting a degree of training in dealing with those people that they never had before?
Well, we've always been, it's sort of been one of our mantras. We've really been very proud of the fact that while the state had a certain prescribed number of hours in so many things, we've always typically doubled what the state did. And so we have been very enriched by a lot of crisis intervention training, de-escalation training, diagnostics and AODA issues in mental illness, working with special populations, whether they be deaf, autistic, dementia, whatever the case may be. So I think we're way ahead of the learning curve over most of our contemporaries, but we got to continue to commit to that. And quite frankly, you know, the mayor's not going to be happy, but I need more cops.
Police chiefs always say that.
Yeah.
And what do we worry about too much that we really shouldn't be?
I would say that at the end of the day, Madison, relative to communities of 250,000 or greater, such as we are, is still relatively safe. The quality of life is exceptional, and there are many things here from which we can build on, but I just don't think we can minimize those issues that are gathering momentum and traction, like we've mentioned the drug use, the influx of so many more people that are hurting from mental illness. We did 165 emergency detention trips last year to Winnebago and Oshkosh. That doesn't include return trips. That doesn't include voluntary admissions. We're dealing with mental health issues in epic volume.
Finally, if I did my math right, you're about 58 years old?
Indeed.
How long are you going to stick around?
How long will the PFC let me?
Well, we have time for you to plug your podcast.
Well, I don't know if it's a plug so much as a reality of the 21st century. What we're trying to do is, as we talk and we're trying to message, we do a blog, inferior that it may be, and then we do various outreach groups, and just as another extension of some things that might be topical, I will do a quick podcast on a weekly basis. So probably in a week from now, you hear something on the M word, Mifflin.
Oh, yeah.
And so we got to talk about those things too.
Yeah, I think it's just your way to keep Joel Despain happy before he leaves for a bigger city where he can be even more creative with his police reports.
He's good.
The best cop PIO in the United States. Well, that is all the time we've got for this episode of Access City Hall on the Madison City Channel. My thanks to everyone here. My thanks to Chief Koval for being with us. And of course, my thanks to you for watching. We'll be back next month with an all-new episode on Access City Hall on the Madison City Channel. Until then, I'm going to stay Stu, you stay you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.